So France once invaded Mexico because a pastry chef got his shop trashed. That's the story, right? A French baker living in Mexico City had his little patisserie ransacked by Mexican soldiers during a riot. He complained to the French government, and King Louis Philippe got so offended on behalf of this man's cream puffs that he sent a fleet of warships across the Atlantic Ocean to bombard a Mexican port city. It's one of those history facts that sounds too ridiculous to be real, and it gets passed around the internet every few months as proof that humans will go to war over literally anything. There's just one problem. Almost none of that is how it actually went down. The real story is somehow more absurd, more cynical, and way more revealing about how powerful nations actually behave when they smell an opportunity. Let's get into it. Here's the version you'll find on most listicles and trivia pages. In 1828, a group of Mexican army officers went on a rampage through the Tacubaya district of Mexico City. During this chaos, they looted a pastry shop owned by a French citizen named Remontel. Remontel filed a complaint. That complaint eventually made its way to the French government. France demanded Mexico pay 600,000 pesos in damages, which was an astronomical sum, and when Mexico refused, France sent warships. War broke out. Mexico lost. The end. It's a clean little anecdote. David versus Goliath, except David is a baker and Goliath is the entire French Navy. And the moral of the story is that empires are petty, and people love it because it reinforces this comforting idea that wars are started by trivial, stupid reasons. That powerful people are just as irrational as the rest of us, just with bigger armies. But that framing gets the cause and effect completely backwards. To understand the real story, you have to understand what Mexico looked like in the 1830s. This was a country that had only been independent from Spain for about 15 years. In that decade and a half, Mexico had already cycled through multiple presidents, survived coup attempts, and was locked in a near-constant state of political instability. Foreign citizens living in Mexico, and there were many, particularly French merchants, shopkeepers, and tradespeople, frequently had their property damaged or destroyed during these upheavals. And it wasn't just Remontel. There were dozens of French citizens filing claims against the Mexican government for property losses, unpaid debts, and broken contracts. Remontel's bakery was one claim among many. The total sum France eventually demanded from Mexico was 600,000 pesos. But that figure represented the accumulated grievances of an entire community of French nationals, not the price tag on one man's stolen éclairs. Now, were some of those claims inflated? Absolutely. Were some of them outright fabricated? Almost certainly. But the point is, France did not wake up one morning, read a letter about a looted pastry shop, and decide to go to war. The pastry shop was a footnote, a colorful detail that Mexican newspapers seized on to mock the French demands, which is actually how the conflict got its name. The Mexicans called it the Guerra de los Pasteles, the Pastry War, as a joke, as satire. And 2 centuries later, we're still repeating the punchline without understanding the setup. So if it wasn't really about pastries, what was it about? This is where the myth versus reality gap becomes a canyon. France in the 1830s, under King Louis Philippe, was aggressively trying to reassert itself as a global colonial power. They had lost Haiti. They had lost Louisiana. They had lost most of their influence in the Americas, and they were watching Britain and the United States expand their economic reach into Latin America with growing anxiety. Mexico, newly independent and politically fragile, was a perfect target. The damage claims from French citizens were real, but they were also a pretext, a convenient legal justification for something France already wanted to do, which was project military power into the Gulf of Mexico and establish favorable trade terms by force. France didn't just demand compensation for property damage. They demanded that French citizens in Mexico be exempt from certain taxes and forced loans that the Mexican government imposed on foreign nationals. These were economic concessions that would have given French merchants a significant competitive advantage. When Mexico refused, France had its excuse. In March of 1838, a French fleet under Rear Admiral Charles Baudin arrived off the coast of Veracruz. They established a naval blockade that strangled Mexican commerce for months. And when Mexico still wouldn't capitulate, France escalated to direct military action. This wasn't a tantrum over baked goods. This was gunboat diplomacy, plain and simple, dressed up in the language of protecting citizens abroad. What happened next was genuinely dramatic, and this is the part of the story that deserves way more attention than it gets. In November of 1838, after months of failed negotiations, Admiral Baudin ordered the bombardment of the fortress of San Juan de Ulua, the massive stone fortification guarding the harbor of Veracruz. The French fleet pounded it with over 180 cannons. The fortress, which had once withstood sieges during the Mexican War of Independence, fell in just a few hours. French Marines then landed in Veracruz itself. And here's where one of the most famous figures in Mexican history enters the picture. General Antonio López de Santa Anna. Yes, that's Santa Anna, the same man who had commanded Mexican forces at the Alamo just 2 years earlier, was living in semi-retirement near Veracruz. When the French attacked, he rushed to the city to organize a defense. In the confused street fighting that followed, Santa Anna was hit by French grape shot, and his left leg was so badly mangled it had to be amputated. Now, Santa Anna being Santa Anna, he turned this into the greatest PR opportunity of his career. He dictated a letter from his sickbed that he clearly expected to be his deathbed, declaring that he hoped all Mexicans would forget his political mistakes and remember only that he gave his leg for his country. He survived, of course, and he milked that lost leg for everything it was worth. He later held a state funeral for the amputated limb, complete with full military honors. The leg was interred in a monument in Mexico City, and when Santa Anna fell from power yet again a few years later, an angry mob dug up the leg and dragged it through the streets. You genuinely cannot make this stuff up. The war, if you can call it that, ended through British mediation. Britain had its own economic interests in Mexico and didn't want France establishing dominance in the region. Under British pressure, Mexico agreed to pay the 600,000 pesos, and France withdrew its fleet. Mexico paid the money, France got what it wanted, and the whole affair was largely forgotten outside of Mexico, where it became a bitter reminder of how vulnerable the young republic was to European coercion. But here's what most retellings leave out entirely. This wasn't the last time France would pull this move. Less than 25 years later, in 1861, France invaded Mexico again. This time on a far larger scale, and actually installed a European emperor, Maximilian of Austria, on a manufactured Mexican throne. That occupation lasted years and cost thousands of lives. The Pastry War wasn't just a quirky historical footnote, it was a dress rehearsal. It established the template that France would use again, taking minor grievances, inflating them into national affronts, and using them to justify military intervention in a country France viewed as politically weak and economically exploitable. The pattern is not funny, it's not quirky, and reducing it to a story about a baker and his ruined pastries does a disservice to everyone who lived through it. So what does this story actually tell us? I think it tells us something uncomfortable about the gap between the reasons nations give for going to war and the reasons they actually go to war. The pastry shop was real. The damage was real. But the war was never about pastries. It was about power, markets, and a fading empire looking for a way back in. And the fact that we've spent nearly 200 years laughing at the funny name instead of examining the ugly machinery underneath it, that says something about us too. We like our history digestible. We like it ironic. But sometimes the irony is a trap that lets the real lesson slip right past us. If this kind of story is what keeps you thinking, keeps you questioning the easy version of events, then stick around. I dig into stuff like this regularly on this channel. Hit subscribe if you want to keep pulling at these threads with me. There's always more underneath the surface than the punchline suggests.